So as many of you know, Brooklyn Beckham, the son of Victoria and David Beckham, came out and posted a testimonial on his story all about the reason for his estrangement with his parents and the sort of rivalry between his mom and his wife. And listen, we do not know these people. We do not know what happened with them. We weren't there. And we're only hearing one side of the story now. I'm going to give the Beckhams the benefit of the doubt and assume that there are certain things from their perspective that we also aren't aware of. However, Brooklyn Beckham's story contained so many familiar themes that I commonly see in family estrangement that I'd like to use what he said just like as a jumping off point to talk about those. Because putting aside the Beckhams and the Peltzes, is that how you pronounce the name? Even if all of what he said is a lie, this is a story that we see so commonly with so many people. So first, let me just read off his stories. I have been silent for years and made every effort to keep these matters private. Unfortunately, my parents and their team have continued to go to the press, leaving me with no choice but to speak for myself and tell the truth about only some of the lies that have been printed. I do not want to reconcile with my family. I'm not being controlled. I'm standing up for myself for the first time in my life. For my entire life, my parents have controlled narratives in the press about our family. The performative social media posts, family events, and inauthentic relationships have been a fixture of the life I was born into. Recently, I've also seen with my own eyes the lengths that they'll go through to place countless lies in the media, mostly at the expense of innocent people, to preserve their own facade. But I believe the truth always comes out. My parents have been trying endlessly to ruin my relationship since before the wedding, and it hasn't stopped. My mom canceled making Nicola's dress in the 11th hour despite how excited she was to wear her design, forcing her to urgently find a new dress. Weeks before our big day, my parents repeatedly pressured and attempted to bribe me into signing away the rights to my name, which would have affected me, my wife, and our future children. They were adamant on me signing before my wedding date because then the terms of the deal would be initiated. My holdout affected the payday, and they have never treated me the same since. During the wedding planning, my mom went so far as to call me evil because Nicola and I chose to include my nanny Sandra and Nicola's nanny at our table because they both didn't have their husbands. Both of our parents had their own tables equally adjacent to ours. The night before our wedding, members of my family told me that Nicola was not blood and not family. Since the moment I started standing up for myself with my family, I've received endless attacks from my parents, both privately and publicly, that were sent to the press on their orders. Even my brothers were sent to attack me on social media before they ultimately blocked me out of nowhere this last summer. My mom hijacked my first dance with my wife, which had been planned weeks in advance, to a romantic love song. In front of our 500 wedding guests, Mark Anthony called me to the stage, where in the schedule was planned to be my romantic dance with my wife, but instead my mom was waiting to dance with me instead. She danced very inappropriately on me in front of everyone. I've never felt more uncomfortable or humiliated in my entire life. We wanted to renew our vows so we could create new memories of our wedding day that bring us joy and happiness, not anxiety and embarrassment. My wife has been consistently disrespected by my family, no matter how hard we've tried to come together as one. My mom has repeatedly invited women from my past into our lives in ways that were clearly intended to make both of us uncomfortable. Despite this, we still traveled to London for my dad's birthday and were rejected for a week as we waited in our hotel room, trying to plan quality time with him. He refused all our attempts unless it was at his big birthday party with 100 guests and cameras at every corner. When he finally agreed to see me, it was under the condition that Nicola wasn't invited. It was a slap in the face. Later, when my family traveled to LA, they refused to see me at all. My family values public promotion and endorsements above all else. Brand Beckham comes first. Family love is decided by how much you post on social media or how quickly you drop everything to show up and pose for a family photo op, even if it's at the expense of our professional obligations. We've gone out of our way for years to show up and support at every fashion show, every party, and every press activity to show our perfect family. But the one time my wife asked for my mom's support to save displaced dogs during the LA fires, my mom refused. The narrative that my wife controls me is completely backwards. I have been controlled by my parents for most of my life. I grew up with overwhelming anxiety. For the first time in my life since stepping away from the family, that anxiety has disappeared. I wake up every morning grateful for the life I chose and have found peace and relief. My wife and I do not want a life shaped by image, press, or manipulation. All we want is peace, privacy, and happiness for us and our future family. So there were so many themes in what he said that were familiar to me that I hear a lot of people talking about when they are discussing their own family estrangement. So this isn't really even about the Beckhams. This is about like estrangement as a whole. If you have ever gone through what he's gone through, I think you probably notice that what he's talking about sounds very textbook. Let's start by talking about the sort of in-group, out-group tribalism that he's describing. This idea of like, Nicola is not blood and she's not one of us. People with certain personality structures, when they meet somebody new, they're trying to assess, are you with me or are you against me? And it even starts as young as babies. When a child is born, sometimes, for instance, a narcissistic parent will be trying to gauge, do I identify with you or do I not? So sometimes they'll see maybe like their own facial features on their child. And because of that, they will think this child is not, their own person, a human being with their own set of traits and characteristics and agency and all that. This child is an extension of me. That's what happens when a narcissistic parent successfully identifies with their baby. If they can't successfully identify with that child will often go on to be a scapegoat, for instance, when the child is just so different from them that it's like, I don't see you as an extension of me. I have even seen people with this personality structure trying to alienate a literal child, like we're talking like a 2-year-old, from family events because they were not blood, because they were not directly related to them, because they were related to somebody else in their family. That's how deep this goes. And that's how obvious it is that when people have this very intense in-group, out-group tribalism, it's really not personal, right? If they're willing to project their worst qualities onto a literal baby, it's not usually anything that the other person has done. And this is the same concept that, when taken to an extreme, was why royalty were so inbred, because it was like, we need to keep it in the family, we need to keep it in the blood. Everyone who isn't us cannot be trusted, is not as good, we are the best in the world. And when you see the way that some of those people turned out, you see like a visual depiction of how monstrous this way of thinking truly can become. But on a smaller scale, in like everyday families today, this in-group, out-group tribalism leads to excluding the person who is not blood, treating them like their spouse's extended family, not someone who is now their spouse's core family. It might be literally not wanting that person to take on the family name. Another theme that he makes me think of is this projection of controlling traits. It is so often in family estrangement that the person who previously held all the power and sort of weaponized it against their children blames a third party for the reason why their child will no longer talk to them, rather than taking responsibility for their contribution to the estrangement. So often they'll blame the therapist, often they'll blame the spouse. It's kind of like this infantilization of their child. It's like, my child can't think for themselves, they're just a puppet, they have no agency. Why would they think that? They might think that if up until that point they were treating their child that way, they were the one telling them what to do and what not to do and having all the power over them, and now the child is no longer letting them do that. Instead of perceiving it as like, my child is developing a healthy sense of self and agency, they perceive it as, oh, somebody else stole my puppet from me. I also find that this sort of narrative often capitalizes off of misogynistic stereotypes. The stereotype of the manipulative, controlling, cunning woman who is stealing a man from his family. It's a little bit cliche, isn't it? It's a little tired. In some cases, what's going on is that the child gets married and their spouse either helps them cope with what they endured from their parents or helps them sort of recognize what their parents have been doing. And the parents, who were previously abusive to the child, do Darvo on them: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. They deny that they actually harmed their child. They attack the person they perceive is planting ideas in their child's head, and they reverse who's actually the victim and the offender. They say, oh, actually, your partner is the abusive ones. They're the ones isolating you and keeping you away from us, when really it was them who was previously doing that to the child. But listen, in some cases, it could be true that the new partner is controlling. There is no shortage of abusive relationships in this world. And in some cases, both could be true at once, where the new partner could be controlling and isolating, and the person's family of origin could be mad that they're no longer the ones to be controlling and isolating the child. It would not be unheard of for someone with that sort of family history to go and marry someone who is in their parents' likeness. It's much more common for people to end up in abusive relationships if they have a history of abuse already. Now, why is it so often that these things come up at weddings? I hear it all the time, where like weddings for some reason bring up and even exacerbate the worst of people, whether it's the bridesmaid, the parents, the bride, the groom, all of it. If we're talking about one of the partner's parents specifically, and those parents don't like the person that their child is marrying, a wedding is a milestone where it becomes very clear that that person is here to stay. It is no longer disputable, right? Like, this is set in stone, this is set in the law, like a formal contract, this is real. If they tried to previously push away that person out of their child's life and it was unsuccessful, the wedding is really where that becomes very apparent, and it's like, oh my God, I'm running out of time. Something else that often happens is a person who is quite controlling might try to exert control over their child's wedding decisions and plans simply because they don't accept that it's supposed to be this special event for someone else. They treat it almost like it's their wedding, like it's about their preferences. So they might try to control like the seating arrangement or the music or the dress. They'll sometimes like neg the bride on her choice of wedding dress. And also for people who have a particular personality style, there's this sort of resentment about not being the center of attention at a wedding. I see this in other settings too, not even necessarily at weddings, where a person will be so upset, literally just sitting there stewing over the fact that they're not monopolizing the conversation in a group setting. And at weddings, people with that type of personality really want to receive special treatment. They want to make sure that they are, for instance, seated with the bride and groom, or the classic, mother-in-law showing up in like a white wedding dress to sort of try to outstage the bride. I remember at me and my husband's wedding, our second wedding, not our first one, because we had like one in Romania and then one that was just like a civil ceremony. We made sure that we were sitting alone at a table because we didn't want anyone to be offended. We didn't want any discussions about like, why does that person get to be there and I don't? Like, we just wanted to be like, we're here doing our own thing. This is where our family is. This is where our friends are. This is where our other friends are, just to like not make any waves. But no matter how hard you try to not make waves, in certain families, that's not really avoidable because the envy and the competitiveness gets to such a point where people start to act out. They feel like this should be about me. I should be the center of this. Why am I not the center of this? They might start sabotaging the event or just like making up things out of thin air or like pretending to pass out or whatever it is. Another theme that Brooklyn's stories made me think of is the way people act when they realize they've lost control over someone they could previously control. I found it interesting that he said his parents called him evil for a choice that they made related to their wedding. Demonization and devaluation of a person can be quite common when somebody realizes that that person is no longer within their control. Instead of saying like, oh, this person set a boundary with me, or this person said no to this thing that I wanted, it's like, this person is evil. They are all bad. Very common when someone realizes, oh, this person I used to be able to control, I can no longer control. It must be because they are becoming this bad entity. Smear campaigns are also super common. When someone realizes that someone they could previously control is now going their own way, they're going to try to smear their name, assassinate their character to anyone who will listen. And yeah, on like a public scale, that could refer to like planting stories in the media. But on a much smaller scale, it can show up in things like triangulation, gossiping to them about other people, trying to turn people that they're friends with against them. Brooklyn spoke of a number of different instances of triangulation. His siblings, Mark Anthony, women from his past. Like, who knows if this is true, but it certainly speaks to a pattern that I recognize, that I have seen when people lose control of someone. And also people who tend to want control over others, they also tend to care more about public perception rather than actual reconciliation. And there is this notion, even with people who aren't famous, of like the family being a brand, needing to preserve that facade of this like happy, perfect family. Other people can't know that there are issues. And so if one person estranges themselves, obviously that creates a lot of issues for that facade because other people can see, oh, this family is not as perfect as they make themselves out to be. And that, I think, is so telling, how people react to the estrangement. Do they react with grief? Do they react with wanting to take responsibility for however they've hurt their loved one? Or is it more in the sense of like, oh my God, what are people going to think? And I've heard a lot of people sort of defending the Beckhams asking Brooklyn to give up his last name. And I gotta say, that's pretty crazy to me. It's pretty crazy to me that you would ask someone to give up the name that they were born with, the name that has been a core piece of their identity up until then, simply because you don't want their partner to also be a part of that brand. And a lot of people saying like, why would Nicola want to take his last name if she hates his family so much? There are a lot of reasons why you would want to take your partner's last name. It sort of cements you as one entity, one family. It's not about necessarily loving that person's family. It's about loving that person, and that person has that name. And the last theme that his stories brought up was emotional. Emotional is when usually a parent treats their child as like a romantic proxy because they don't have their romantic needs met from their partner, either because their partner is sort of emotionally checked out, or because their partner is cheating on them, or because maybe they don't have a partner. Like single moms are often at risk of emotional. So they're used to their whole life treating that child like their romantic proxy and doing things with them that you would associate more with like a romantic context. A responsibility that's just way too much to put on a child. And so when that child goes and meets someone and wants to marry them, that can result in a lot of competitiveness for the parent who was previously treating them like a romantic proxy. Because it doesn't feel like my child is getting married, they found the love of their life. It feels like somebody is stealing my partner from me. It's really twisted. It really is. But that's how it feels emotionally for people who have had that pattern with their child up until that point. So Brooklyn brings up a lot of really common themes from family estrangement. Again, I need to highlight that we don't know these people. We don't know where the truth lies. For all we know, this could be a distortion on his part. But the fact that he touched on so many common themes makes me believe him, honestly. Because unless he's like some mastermind who has studied family estrangement for no reason at all, he's just like a psychology guru, and he managed to concoct this wild, untrue story that happens to match with everything that typically happens in these situations. To me, that's just like not very likely. And please remember, this is not about finding like who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Even victims can sometimes be a bad guy. And even the bad guy in someone's story might not be a bad guy overall. And more importantly, putting aside the Beckhams altogether, is this something that you've experienced in your personal life? Because that's actually the reason I'm making this video and what I actually care about.